Hey, everybody. It's JD Roth from Get Rich Slowly.
Good morning, and I'm Kim.
And we're here for our second Saturday morning money conversation. This time, we're a little more prepared. We've set up the microphone, got everything set up. Kim's in the sun. I'm not. It'll work. And we thought today we'd talk about a really important subject, and that's homeownership. Housing is like the largest single expense in the average American budget. And as such, it's a huge opportunity to save money, to better your financial position. And it's also an opportunity, if you're not careful, to end up getting in a really bad financial position.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That actually happened to me on my second house. I bought my first house at 26, paid $103,000 for it. I don't remember the year.
Yeah,
but I was like, oh, I can afford this. But in the second house, I had a mortgage broker who was a friend of mine, and she knew what I did for a living. And she's like, Kim, there's no way you're not going to be making more than this next year, and more than that the year after, and more than that the year after. So anyway, I was inexperienced and in my 20s, and she essentially talked me into buying a house that was like 40 some odd % of my annual income. And
wow.
It's a bad ratio. And so I got in over my head, and I was totally house poor. I had to get roommates. It really affected my lifestyle and the things I enjoyed doing. I was totally sucked into my house as my entire existence.
Yeah. So, when you're spending 40%, when your house is 40% of your budget, you're having to dedicate so much time and money and energy into that house that it becomes overwhelming.
Yeah, I just bought too much house. I didn't need that much. It was like 17 or 1,800 square feet, 5 acres. I lived alone. It's like, well, I had roommates so that I could afford it. But I just remember my house payment being almost $2,000. And in my 20s, this is 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a lot of money now. So the average American household spends, as Jake notes in the comments, it spends about a third of its budget on housing. That's the average amount that the average American household spends. And that's huge. That's more than food and entertainment and all this other stuff combined. The second biggest expense is transportation, and that's 17%. That's half of housing.
So it's not eating out or alcohol?
No. Well, maybe for some of us. So yeah, if you buy too much house, if you spend too much money on your house, you can end up house poor. And it's a very real danger. During the housing boom, a lot of folks got convinced that they could buy an expensive house, buy more home than they needed, and then they ended up in trouble. They got conned. I don't want to say conned. They got convinced that this was the right move for them, and that the housing prices would keep going up. And then housing prices didn't keep going up.
Oh my God, you have no idea. I literally sold this house right as the bubble was getting ready to burst. This was in California. And it's so funny, the difference in psyche too, because when I owned my first home, I had so much money I just kept saving money. I didn't know what to do with it. And I was too young and dumb to know how to invest or what to do. So I bought a bigger house, a more expensive house. And the psyche, for me, I was stressed all the time. Yeah. It was really like a sense of anxiety for me all the time. And I hated having roommates. So I only owned that house for like 5 years. And the thing that's interesting is that she had convinced me, it was kind of a duo thing happening. They had convinced me that this was the right move. I did love the property. And instead of increasing my income, I decided to go back to school. Oh. Because I was miserable, and I was miserable in my job, and I was just very unhappy. And in so doing, believe it or not, I actually took a pay cut from what I was doing.
Wow.
Yeah, I went from managing to doing what I do now, but I'm so much happier. But the bottom line is I could no longer afford my house.
Yeah.
I had to make a huge life decision at that point.
And so in my case, my story is a little similar. So I bought my first house in 1993. Chris, my ex-wife, and I bought it together, and it was a small house. It was just a modest ranch house, and we could afford it. It was fine. Then in 2004, it was mainly me, but it was Chris too. We decided, on the spur of the moment, that we wanted to buy this one house. Somebody brought a house flyer to work and showed it to Chris, And Chris brought it home, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's my dream house. It's this 100-year-old farmhouse on like 2/3 of an acre in Portland. And so we bought it. And on paper, it was an affordable decision. On paper, I could afford it. But in reality, once we moved in, it was like the straw that broke my back. At the time, remember, I was deep in debt. I was struggling with personal finances. And I didn't really know how to make this all work because we had so many repair costs. Yes, the dog is here as always. We had so many repair costs, and the mortgage was so much more expensive in the first place that I felt like I was just drowning in debt and couldn't possibly recover. And that was actually led to the start of Get Rich Slowly. This is the part of the Get Rich Slowly mythology.
I want to point out something. I think this is an important thing to talk about, especially for new homeowners and the millennials now that are trying to afford to save up for their first home. Not only do you need a 20% down, I think that's what it still is.
Yeah.
You really have to take into consideration the actual cost of owning a home because it is not just your mortgage payment.
Absolutely.
You need to have a buffer set aside because there are so many external expenses and emergencies and things that come up. Water heaters go out. I know people in California who've had to re-drill their well for their water. That's expensive. That's like $25,000.
Wow.
It's expensive. So anyway, just, you really need to take into consideration, do you have enough money for the things that are going to happen as well?
Yeah. And I think the rule of thumb that I've always heard is that you need to set aside in a special maintenance account roughly you need to anticipate roughly 1% of your home's value. You're going to spend that much on maintenance each year. So if you have say a $250,000 home, you should budget around $2,500 in maintenance every year. But the thing is, those expenses, it's not smooth. It's not like you can anticipate, every month it's going to be $200 for maintenance or $2,500 per year. It's clumpy because
it's clumpy. That's
your,
a good way to
your well goes out or whatever. Or you do something like what Kim and I did. We bought this house 18 months ago, or it doesn't matter, a year ago.
Yeah.
And it needed maintenance right away. I mean, we knew going into it that it was going to be expensive, that there were things that needed to be repaired. But we didn't realize just how much repair needed to be done on it. And so we spent a small fortune getting things fixed here.
Well, and real quick, because I want to answer Jake's question. He's got a couple good questions, but the first one is, do you plan to own? Would you ever rent for flex? God, I really have to squint. Do you have you ever considered renting for flexibility? And the answer is yes. I did it for 10 years before we bought this place because it fit my lifestyle. I was traveling a lot. I went back to school. I was trying to decide where to settle. I didn't want the burden of home ownership for it. It was a solid 10 years. Where it just worked for my lifestyle. And as a matter of fact, the sense of freedom that it gave me after coming out of the previous scenario where I was house poor really worked for what it was that I was trying to achieve in my life at the time, going back to school, changing career directions. I definitely think there's a time and a place for that. And then his second question on that was, any thoughts on house hacking?
Do you know what house hacking is? This is good.
I don't know. Is it like flipping or renting or what?
It's similar. So house hacking, and Jake, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think what he's talking about is you buy, for example, a duplex and maybe a rundown duplex, and you fix it up. You live in one half of the duplex while you rent out the other half. Or in your case, like you were talking about how you had roommates in the one house that was too expensive. So house hacking is basically buying a house and then renting out some portion of it so that you're covering your mortgage costs. And maybe not.
I think it's a great idea if you don't mind roommates.
Right. Yeah. Or you don't mind being a landlord. I mean, like if you have a duplex or a triplex, I know some people, like many viewers are probably familiar with Paula Pant from Afford Anything. Paula did this to help build her now burgeoning real estate empire. She and Will bought a home that they had to fix up, and they rented out parts of that while they lived in it. Yeah. So I think it's a smart idea.
Yeah, it really is.
So I wanted to touch briefly on the whole renting thing. It wasn't something that I planned to dive into today, but I want to point out that renting is not throwing your money away. There's a lot of propaganda out there from what I call the real estate industrial complex. There's propaganda out there that says renting is throwing your money away. If you buy a home, it's a forced savings plan, and it is. But renting isn't necessarily throwing your money away. It can be a smart choice. It depends on the market you're in. You've really got to crunch the numbers. The New York Times has a great rent versus buy calculator. And if you want to figure out whether it makes more sense for you to rent or to buy in your situation, I recommend Googling the New York Times rent versus buy calculator and crunching the numbers, because it might make more sense for you to rent. And like you said, in some cases, renting gives you flexibility, or there are reasons to do it, even if it's not necessarily the top financial decision at the moment. There might be other considerations. Yep. I'm going to scroll down here. I see. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about figuring out how much home you can afford, because we're talking about what happens if you get into a situation where you're spending too much money on a house. But how do you know how much house you can afford? The issue I found is, again, I talk about the real estate industrial complex. It's a play on the military industrial complex. The real estate industry is designed to convince you that you can spend as much money as you want on a house. This is from your real estate agent to your mortgage broker to the bank. Everybody in the system wants you to spend more because they make more when you spend more. And they don't necessarily have nefarious aims. I don't want to make it sound like they're doing this because they're bad people. That's not the case. It's just they've bought into this idea that housing is some sort of panacea. It's some sort of thing that is going to give, I don't know, future financial well-being, when that's not always the case. Right. So you can be more rational about approaching how much house you can afford. So the measure when you're figuring out how much you can afford is what's called a debt to income ratio. And the debt to income ratio, at least the part that we're talking about, is how much, there are two numbers. First is the debt, or the housing payment. What is your total housing payment each month? Your mortgage, your insurance, your interest, all this stuff. That's the first number. And then you divide that by your pre-tax, your gross income. So for example, if your theoretical housing payment is $2,000 per month, and you're bringing home $10,000 per month pre-tax, then your debt to income ratio is 20%. So in the olden days, back when the world was young, back in the 1970s, the standard debt to income ratio advice was 25%. You could afford to spend 25% of your pre-tax income on housing. Now, when I bought my first home in 1993, that had adjusted so that it was 28%. It had crept up just a little bit. But then when Chris and I bought a house in 2004, that number was even higher. It was up to 33%. And then during the housing bubble, and even nowadays, the modern numbers went up to 41%, 42%, even as high as 45%. I'm going to get out of the sun here so that I'm not.
It passes. It's really quick.
All right. So when you look at that, the old ratio that used to be acceptable was 25% in the 1970s. And nowadays it's 40, 42%. Well, obviously, if you're spending that much more on housing, it's going to be much more difficult to make the payments. The banks and the realtors, everybody will try to tell you that, yes, you can afford that 42% or whatever the number is they're pushing. But my advice is try to stick as close to that 25%, the old guideline, as possible, because there's a reason it was there. That was a sensible thing. Back in the day, they were doing that because it was sensible, because they knew homeowners could afford it. Now they set the higher numbers because they know the homeowners can make the payments, and it's in the best interest of the bank. They don't care whether the homeowner struggles. You've got to look out for yourself. I always say that nobody cares more about your money than you do, and this is an example of that. You've got to take charge. You've got to be proactive and say, no, wait a minute, Mr. Realtor, we're looking at houses. You're pushing me towards the top end of my budget. Let's look at some stuff at the lower end.
Right. And, hi, Karen, by the way, I was reading your comment. She brings up a good point too, in that she rented for 18 years while she moved up the career ladder. And then eventually, when she could afford to buy her first home, which she did this year, congratulations. Love Louisville, by the way. anyway, so this is yet another example in where working toward whatever it is your goal is financially, homeownership, whatever is, renting can work for some people.
Absolutely.
And I come from a generation where it was just given that the thing you're working toward is buying a house.
Yep.
It's a sense of security. I was just taught that that's the thing that you work towards. That is literally like the goal to making more money.
It's part of the American dream, right?
Yeah. House and car.
Well, and the thing is, that's a newer part of the American dream too. So we in the United States sometimes don't have a sense of our own history. And one thing to realize is that homeownership used to be something for people in rural areas, for farmers, for example. It made sense for them to own their homes, but people in cities didn't own homes as much. I've looked into the stats before, and back in the 1890s, only about 48% of people owned their homes, and most of those folks lived in the country. They were farmers, and it was only after World War II that homeownership rates began to skyrocket. So homeownership during World War II, or just before World War II, was about 43%, I think. And then by 1960, it had gone up to 62%. So that's a huge jump.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of reasons for that jump. One is the US government introduced the GI Bill, which allowed, it made it easier for veterans to purchase homes. And second, the real estate industry came into full power, into fruition during the 40s and 50s. And again, this started pushing people into homeownership. So homeownership it seems like part of the American dream to me too, for people in our generation, but it hasn't always been the case. Another thing to note is that homes have been just getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Oh my God, I know. And we downsized, and I love it.
Yeah.
But, people are also, in so doing, bringing in other family members to live with them. They're accommodating.
In larger homes?
Yeah. So, well, this is what my patients have been telling me. And the ADUs. People are building these ADUs because they've now got kids that aren't leaving as early as they used to. They're staying and living on. They've got parents that are staying with them. I feel like because of the economy and where we're at, people are using multiple streams of income to be able to afford their house, whether that's family members living with them, roommates, taking on side gigs, having dual income households. It is what it takes to own a home now for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. This is not something that I have much exposure to. So
I just talk to lots of people during the day.
So Kim is a dental hygienist, so she gets to talk to all sorts of people and get all sorts of stories and all sorts of insights into how people live.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
So home sizes have increased. In 1973, the average home size was about 1,250 square feet, and that's about the size of the house that we're in now. But by 2004, that had grown to almost 2,500 square feet was the average home size. So,
a lot of house.
Yeah, it's almost doubling in size in a matter of 40 years. And during that time, it went. The average person used to have about 500 square feet of space, and now they have almost 1,000 square feet of space per person. And I understand that there are times when having a larger home and having more space per person makes sense, but I would argue that from our experience, especially living in the RV for 15 months, it's not a necessity. And in fact, in a lot of ways, having a smaller space is more manageable, more livable, and I like it.
I do too.
Yeah.
It's cozy. We've got our little nooks.
Yeah.
You think that you're going to get under each other's skins, condensing space, but you don't. You give each other your space, and you have your little spots you go to when you need privacy. And we've loved it. Do we want to talk at all about some of the reasons why people want to buy a home, why it's an emotional decision?
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so we made some brief notes about this kind of stuff. We talked about it last night. And, one of the things for me is just, it's a huge sense of security. I feel safer. I feel less vulnerable. I don't worry about a landlord either raising my rent or kicking me out or selling the house out from under me. You tend to live in a place where there are other homeowners. And so you have a bigger sense of community. You get to know your neighbors. I mean, I feel like everybody kind of looks out for each other.
Yeah. In our neighborhood, everyone has a dog, and the dogs get loose. And so we're always tracking down each other's dogs.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, I guess for me, it fills some emotional voids. And maybe that's why it's always an emotional decision when people buy homes. But being able to landscape your own yard or decorate the way you want to, or paint when you decide to paint, or all of these things you can't do when you're a renter. It's a sense of freedom and liberation for me, and artistic expression.
And for me, I think that's a huge advantage of owning a home. So being able to do what you want to the place when you want is fantastic. So
we've created our little oasis. We spend, I mean, who cares about the 1250? Because our yard, we spend half our time outside.
We have just over an acre of land, and we've done all sorts of stuff out here. We built this deck and put in the hot tub, and we've created nooks. We've created like an oasis. You call it an oasis, I think. And this is something that is much more difficult or impossible to do when you're renting. Back when I bought my first home, I didn't understand that this is something that set homeownership apart from renting. When Chris and I bought our first home in 1993, it was a nice place, but we didn't do anything to it. We just lived in it as we had bought it, and it took like almost a decade for us to realize, oh, we can modify this however we want. We can tear out the floor in the office, and we can put in our new floor. We can paint whatever we want. We can do whatever we want with this place. It's like a blank canvas for us to do things with. And that's something I think new homeowners don't always realize, is it's your house. You can do what you want with it.
Sorry, I have a dog who's ready for her walk.
The dog wants attention. This is her walk time, and we're infringing upon it, and she knows it. Poor puppy. There are other advantages of owning a home. For one, I mentioned earlier that sometimes people view it as a forced saving plan, and in a way, it is a forced
saving plan. Yeah, right. It may not be like the best investment you're ever going to make. There are definitely better things you can do with your money, but it sure is a way to force yourself to save.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So back when I was undisciplined and in debt, the only way that I was actually building wealth was the fact that I was paying my mortgage every month.
Yeah.
And at one point, Chris and I actually went from a 30-year mortgage to a 15-year mortgage. And when we did that, I was saving even more. I was building even more equity. And if I hadn't done that, I would have been in an even worse position than I was back in 2004, 2005, 2006. Another advantage to owning a home is if you want, you can get rid of housing payments forever.
Right.
You can pay off that mortgage and just be done with it. And then all you have to worry about is taxes and insurance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things I had listed as well, almost identically what you just said. And you're paying yourself instead of paying money to somebody else. And that's hard to argue with.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. What are some other disadvantages?
To home ownership?
Yeah.
Man, it's kind of the things that bring you to the advantages of renting. The disadvantages are you are very tied to your house. And for us, we love traveling. So every time we leave, not only that, but we have pets, we have to have somebody come watch water stuff, watch the animals. I wish we could put in auto sprinklers, but we can't because we have super low water pressure because of our well.
Yeah.
Anyway, you are definitely more cumbered by your investment.
Yeah. And you and I both, I don't want to say we're flighty, but we like new experiences and we like experiencing new things.
That's adventurous. That's not flighty.
Oh, okay. We're adventurous. So like the RV trip, we managed to make that work despite the fact that we owned a place. We had house sitters for an extended period of time. But if you and I decide that, say we want to move to Fargo, North Dakota for whatever reason to just experience life, or maybe go down and spend a year or two near your brother in California, then it's much more difficult for us to do that when we own a home, because we either have to figure out how to rent it or we have to sell it. Whereas if we were just renting an apartment, or renting a house, we could make that transition much more easily.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and obviously, financially, sometimes that could be a little bit more cumbersome. I can't think of too many other disadvantages. I'm sure other people can, but.
I know one disadvantage that I think of all the time. You're responsible for everything.
Oh, right. Yeah, which is another good point, right? So if you're going to own your home, make sure you keep a really good list of contractors you like, service providers that you like, people that you may need to use time and time again. You don't want to go through the same process every single time something needs to be repaired. I mean, we've definitely found our guys that we really love working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And
trust.
This brings up a good way to end the episode, I think, is to talk about what I consider the number one skill of being a homeowner, and that is being proactive. I think that as a homeowner, your number one job is to stay on top of everything. And that's not just your mortgage payment. That's staying on top of maintenance. It's staying on top of, well, whatever is involved with the house, you know?
Yeah, you got to have your shit together, man. You can't just, no deferred maintenance. That's what actually we got into at this place was the previous owners. Total deferred is like 20 years of nothing. And you can't do that. I mean, you can, but you shouldn't.
Right. And so the people who owned this place before, super nice people, but they hadn't done any maintenance on the house during the 17 years that they owned it. So when we moved in, we had to replace the roof. That was fine. But the siding was failing. There were soft spots in the floor. There was just so much stuff going on that they had not taken care of. I mean, the fences are still falling down. But if they had stayed here, they would have had all these costs that we inherited through the purchase. And it just becomes, when you put off maintenance, it seems like it's a great thing in the short term because you're not having to deal with it, but you're just creating problems for yourself later on, or problems for future owners, problems with resale value. So being a proactive homeowner, other ways to do that, have a plan for how you're going to repay your mortgage. Most people just go along and they just pay the monthly mortgage payment, and that's fine. But figure out, do you want to pay it off early? Are you going to stay in the place for a long time? If you're not, well, then maybe it makes sense to just stick with the normal mortgage plan. But I think I messed that up. Doesn't matter. If you're not going to stay in the place, if you're not going to stay in the place for a long time, you might want to just make the normal mortgage payments. But if you are going to stay there for a while, I think it makes sense to consider accelerating the mortgage payments, figuring out ways, maybe move from a 30-year to a 15-year mortgage, or just make extra mortgage or extra payments on your mortgage each month. Because if you can get rid of that mortgage, it gives you a lot more freedom financially. We talked about budgeting 1% of your home's value for maintenance each year. I think it's great to do a couple of things. First of all, have a maintenance schedule for stuff that you know has to be done every year, like cleaning the gutters, or in our case, pulling down the ivy off the fences, or whatever it might be. Create a maintenance schedule so that you know, oh, this is the stuff I need to do in March, April, June, whenever it is. Also, maintain a to-do list for irregular stuff. We've got a to-do list in that house on the counter right now.
Ongoing. Yeah.
So there's always stuff. For example, we need to put a gutter on the deck. We just installed the deck here. So it needs a gutter. And then I think it's a good idea to set aside at least one weekend every quarter where all you're doing is spending that weekend doing house stuff. In our case, we're doing it about once a month, but that's because we're new here and there's so much to do. But once you've got it all under control, I think setting aside at least one weekend every quarter is very smart. You talked about building a list of trusted contractors.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yep.
And then the final thing I would say to be a proactive homeowner is keep a journal of everything you're doing. This is nothing I've ever done until moving into this house. So for the first 25 years I owned a home, I didn't do this, but it's a skill I've learned. I'm keeping track of all the different things that we're doing to this house as we do them in a Microsoft Word document. Every time something happens, say we had to replace the toilet for some reason, I would go into the Microsoft Word document and I would say, on this date, we had to replace the toilet and here's why, and here's what we did. And it's good documentation for yourself.
It's really a good idea. I'm glad that you like doing that kind of stuff.
Because it's not
my forte.
But I think my hope is that it will also help with the resale value of the home.
Yeah.
Now, I might be deluding myself because when we went to sell the RV, we have documentation of all the stuff we'd done to the RV, and many prospective buyers viewed the things we had done as downsides rather than upsides.
But that's because so here's the thing. I don't think you need to like be blasting all of these things that you've done. Just have the information there if they ask.
Okay, fair enough.
That's
fair enough.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
Wow, that is great.
So, the sun's got you now, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, we've got more questions. I hadn't seen those come in.
Comment on your thinking about paying.
So
Right.
Kathy has a great question. Kathy says, can you comment on your thinking about paying cash for the versus taking out a mortgage when someone has the option to do both? This is one of those situations where it's a great position to be in, right?
It really is. And
And I will say that for this house, we had to pay cash because we didn't have enough income on record to take out a mortgage. So we had to pay cash. But I wish we could have got a mortgage.
Yeah, me too. We touched, if you weren't here last week, we touched on that briefly. You know, he didn't qualify for a loan because he has no actual source of income coming in. And I didn't qualify for a loan because we had just gotten back from the RV trip, and I didn't have enough work history, even though we both had plenty of money on paper here and there to I would think be a very secure loan. They wouldn't do it.
So, Kathy, I think the choice about whether you pay cash for a home or take out a mortgage is a very personal thing. It depends on what your objectives are. Generally speaking, the conventional wisdom is if mortgage rates are low, as they have been, then you probably want to take out a mortgage, because if the mortgage rate is 3%, 3.5%, or even 4%, then you can probably take the money that you otherwise would have in the house and use it somewhere else,
right?
The stock market specifically, to get better returns. And that's what I wish I could do right now. This home cost us $442,000, and I wish I had that $442,000 in the stock market, because over the past 14 months, I'll get the number right pretty soon here. Over the past 14 months, the stock market has gone up significantly, and we would have made a good return on that money, even though we would be carrying a mortgage. Now, that said, some people really like the peace of mind of having a paid off house.
Right. I mean, there's more than one way to look at it. Your point is, I think, well taken for somebody who thinks like we do, you know, that we are constantly thinking about how to make money work for us.
Yeah.
But if you're somebody, and I've been in this position before too, where your peace of mind is the most important thing for you to be thinking about, then that might change your decision.
Yeah.
And Jordan had a question also. Any thoughts on building instead of buying?
I don't actually. This is a great question. I've known people who've built homes.
I've never looked into the cost. I mean, I know it takes a long time, but I've never looked into cost-wise. Being able to customize, of course, that's fantastic. There's lots of things I would rather we did differently here, but are you asking financially, like if it's better or worse, or just wanting to know general thoughts? Because I really don't know. I don't have enough information.
I don't either. We'll see whether Jordan replies. For me, I like the idea. I don't know anything about building a home, not from a financial perspective or from any other perspective. So I don't have an answer to what I feel about that. And I would love to know more. I would actually love if some Get Rich Slowly readers were to give me their perspective on building a home versus buying, because I would like to find out more about that.
Yeah, me too, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe our next one, that'll be it.
Well, speaking of next one, next week, Kim and I will be back, same time, same place. And we are going to be talking about finding the best bank accounts and credit cards.
Yep. Love me some USAA and Ally Bank.
She's always pitching that. Yep.
Me too.
And then the week after that, September 1st, we'll be back to talk about finding ways to earn more money.
At this point, we've only committed to doing this for 4 weeks. We may continue to do it later, but not necessarily on a Saturday morning.
Saturday morning at 8 seems a little tough. So
anyway, let us know if you guys have ideas or topics you want us to discuss, so that we have time to kind of do some research and get back to you on the things that you're wondering about. So,
yeah, absolutely. And we're doing our best to get better with each episode. This week, we were much more organized. We had the microphone to start. We had notes to start. We had a plan.
We woke up like an hour before instead of 20
minutes before. Yeah, it was much better. So anyway, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Happy Saturday.
Peace.